I'm going to take you on a journey through the Vietnam War that will change the way you think about history, and I promise you'll feel you're right there in the action. Please check for important links that you might find useful. Later in the video, the Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, was one of the most significant and divisive conflicts of the 20th century. It was a prolonged struggle rooted in colonial history, ideological battles between communism and capitalism, and the global Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. The war was fought primarily between the Communist North Vietnamese forces, led by the Viet Cong and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRV, and the anti-communist South Vietnamese government, backed heavily by the United States and its allies. The war had deep historical roots that stretched back to the era of French colonial rule. Vietnam, part of French Indochina, had long struggled for independence. After World War II, nationalist and communist leader Ho Chi Minh led the Viet Minh resistance against French colonial forces, culminating in the decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. This victory forced France to withdraw, leading to the Geneva Accords, which temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, establishing a communist government in the north under Ho Chi Minh and a non-communist government in the south led by Ngo Dinh Diem. However, this division was never meant to be permanent. National elections, scheduled for 1956 to reunify the country, were blocked by the South Vietnamese government with U.S. support, fearing a likely communist victory. This refusal set the stage for escalating tensions, eventually leading to armed conflict. By the early 1960s, the Viet Cong, a communist guerrilla force in the South, had begun an insurgency against the U.S.-backed government, prompting increasing American military involvement. The war quickly escalated from a regional struggle into a full-scale Cold War battleground. The United States, determined to contain the spread of communism in Southeast Asia under the domino theory, significantly increased its military presence. The pivotal Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, where North Vietnamese forces allegedly attacked U.S. naval vessels, led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting President Lyndon B. Johnson broad authority to escalate U.S. military action. This marked the beginning of full-scale U.S. involvement, with hundreds of thousands of American troops being deployed and a brutal, prolonged war unfolding in the jungles of Vietnam. What followed was a conflict characterized by intense jungle warfare, guerrilla tactics, widespread bombing campaigns, and immense suffering for both soldiers and civilians. As the war dragged on, it sparked widespread protests, political upheaval, and a shift in global perceptions of U.S. foreign policy. Ultimately, the Vietnam War would leave an enduring impact on Vietnam, the United States, and the world, reshaping military strategy, geopolitical dynamics, and public attitudes toward war. This storyline will explore the complex and multifaceted history of the Vietnam War, from its origins and key battles to its political ramifications and lasting consequences. The roots of the Vietnam War stretch deep into Vietnam's colonial past, shaped by decades of foreign domination, nationalist resistance, and global power struggles. Understanding the historical context of the war requires examining Vietnam's experience under French colonial rule, the disruptive Japanese occupation during World War II, the rise of nationalist and communist movements, and the critical events that led to the country's first declaration of independence. French colonial rule, 1887 to 1940, the exploitation of Vietnam. Vietnam became part of French Indochina in 1887, alongside Cambodia and Laos, marking the beginning of a long period of colonial exploitation and resistance. The French saw Vietnam as a valuable source of economic wealth, using its land and labor to support their growing empire. They established plantations for rubber, coffee, and rice, with much of the production exported to benefit France, while Vietnamese laborers toiled under harsh conditions with little compensation. French rule also brought cultural suppression and political repression. The French imposed their language and customs, discouraging the use of Vietnamese in government and education. They restricted access to education, ensuring that only a small elite could receive French-style schooling. Meanwhile, political participation for native Vietnamese was nearly non-existent, and any efforts at resistance were met with brutal crackdowns. The resentment toward colonial rule led to the emergence of nationalist movements, with various groups advocating for Vietnamese self-rule. However, these movements were often divided. Some sought gradual reforms within the colonial system, while others, like communist factions, pushed for a revolutionary overthrow of French control. World War II and Japanese occupation, 1940 to 1945, a catalyst for change. With the outbreak of World War II, Vietnam's colonial status became even more precarious. In 1940, Nazi Germany's conquest of France weakened the French administration in Indochina. Soon after, Japan, expanding its empire in the Pacific, occupied Vietnam while allowing the French colonial government to remain in place as a puppet administration. Under Japanese rule, Vietnam's resources were drained to support Tokyo's war effort. The Japanese seized food supplies, repurposing agricultural production for their troops. This, combined with devastating floods, led to one of the darkest tragedies in Vietnamese history, the 1945 famine, in which about 1 to 2 million Vietnamese people starved to death. The harsh conditions under both French and Japanese rule fueled anti-colonial resistance. Many Vietnamese saw the crisis as proof that their country needed self-governance to prevent foreign exploitation. This period became a turning point, providing an opening for revolutionary movements to grow in strength. Emergence of nationalist and communist movement, the rise of the Viet Minh. The chaos of World War II gave rise to Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh League for the Independence of Vietnam. Founded in 1941, the Viet Minh was a communist-led nationalist movement dedicated to ending foreign rule in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, a longtime revolutionary who had spent years in exile studying Marxism and organizing anti-colonial resistance, positioned himself as the leader of Vietnam's fight for independence. The Viet Minh waged a guerrilla campaign against both Japanese occupiers and French colonial authorities, gradually gaining the support of peasants and intellectuals alike. They established jungle bases in northern Vietnam, training fighters and building a resistance network. Weapons and supplies were secured from the Allies, including China and the Soviet Union, strengthening their military capabilities. By 1944-45, as Japan's grip on Vietnam weakened amid its declining fortunes in World War II, the Viet Minh seized the opportunity to expand their control over vast rural areas. The August Revolution, 1945, Vietnam's first declaration of independence. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a power vacuum emerged in Vietnam. Sensing their moment, the Viet Minh launched the August Revolution, swiftly taking control of major cities, including Hanoi and Saigon. On September 2, 1945, Ho Chi Minh stood in Ba Dinh Square, Hanoi, and read the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence, modeled after the U.S. Declaration of Independence. Before a crowd of thousands, he proclaimed the establishment of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRV, marking the first time Vietnam had declared itself a sovereign nation after nearly a century of foreign rule. However, Vietnam's independence was far from secured. As the war in the Pacific ended, the victorious Allied powers, particularly France and the United States, had different plans for the region. France sought to reclaim its former colony, refusing to recognize Ho Chi Minh's government. The United States, initially sympathetic to Vietnamese independence, soon became wary of Ho Chi Minh's communist ideology amid the growing Cold War tensions. What followed was a series of political maneuverings and armed conflicts that would ultimately lead to the First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954, a bloody struggle that laid the groundwork for the Vietnam War. This section highlights the historical forces that set the stage for the conflict to come, showing how Vietnam's long history of colonial oppression, war, and nationalist resistance made the Vietnam War an almost inevitable outcome. The First Indochina War, 10 to 1800 hours. The First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954, was a pivotal struggle between the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, and France, which sought to reclaim its former colony following World War II. It was a brutal and prolonged conflict that combined guerrilla warfare, major battles, and Cold War geopolitics. Ultimately, the war culminated in a decisive victory for the Viet Minh at Dien Bien Phu, reshaping the future of Vietnam and setting the stage for the Vietnam War. French resistance and reoccupation, 1945 to 1946, the colonial struggle resumes. Following the August Revolution, 1945, and Ho Chi Minh's Declaration of Independence, Vietnam's future hung in the balance. France, unwilling to lose its colony, sought to reassert control over Vietnam. Meanwhile, Britain and the United States, initially sympathetic to Vietnamese independence, shifted their stance, fearing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. British troops entered southern Vietnam in September 1945, disarming Japanese forces and allowing the return of French colonial authorities. In the north, Chinese nationalist forces, Kuomintang, occupied the region, but they were more interested in extorting resources than governing Vietnam. The Viet Minh used this period to consolidate power. By early 1946, the French had returned in full force, retaking control of key cities like Hanoi and Saigon. Ho Chi Minh, aware that the Viet Minh could not yet militarily defeat the French, engaged in diplomatic negotiations. The March 6, 1946 agreement temporarily recognized Vietnam as a free state within the French Union, but tensions quickly escalated. In November 1946, a French naval bombardment of Haiphong Harbor killed thousands of Vietnamese civilians, marking the start of all-out war. Early Viet Minh strategy, 1946 to 1950, guerrilla warfare and resistance. Facing a superior French military, the Viet Minh adopted a strategy of guerrilla warfare, drawing from Maoist principles of prolonged revolutionary struggle. Under the leadership of General Vuong Nguyen Giap, the Viet Minh executed a three-phase military strategy. Strategic defense, 1946 to 1949. Avoid large-scale battles, focus on ambushes, sabotage, and assassinations of French collaborators. Equilibrium, 1949 to 1952. Engage in larger guerrilla operations while strengthening political control in rural areas. Counteroffensive, 1952 to 1954. Transition to conventional warfare, striking decisive blows against the French. The countryside became the stronghold of the Viet Minh, where they built networks of tunnels, supply routes, and base areas. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of jungle paths used to transport troops and supplies, was already being developed. During this period, the war was not just military but also political. The Viet Minh engaged in land reforms, mobilized peasants, and promoted nationalist propaganda, securing widespread support among rural populations. International support and the shift in balance, 1949 to 1953. The dynamics of the war changed significantly in 1949 when China's Communist Revolution succeeded. Mao Zedong's People's Republic of China began providing weapons, training, and sanctuary to the Viet Minh. Around the same time, the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, heightened Cold War tensions, prompting the United States to increase its support for the French. The U.S. began financing the French war effort, covering up to 80% of France's military expenses in Indochina by 1954. The Soviet Union and China supplied the Viet Minh with modern weapons, including artillery, rifles, and anti-aircraft defenses. This external backing allowed the Viet Minh to transition from guerrilla warfare to large-scale conventional battles. By the early 1950s, it was clear that the war had reached a turning point, with the Viet Minh growing stronger and French morale declining. Battle of Dien Bien Phu, 1954, the defining moment. The defining battle of the war occurred in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu, a remote valley in northern Vietnam. The French believed that by establishing a fortified base there, they could lure the Viet Minh into a decisive confrontation and crush them with superior firepower. However, they gravely underestimated their enemy. General Vuong Nguyen Giap meticulously planned the attack, moving tens of thousands of Viet Minh troops and heavy artillery through mountainous terrain in complete secrecy. On March 13, 1954, the Viet Minh launched their assault, using trench warfare and relentless artillery bombardments to pin down French forces. The battle lasted 57 days, with the French enduring constant artillery barrages, food shortages, and disease. The Viet Minh gradually tightened their grip, overwhelming French positions hill by hill. On May 7, 1954, Dien Bien Phu fell, marking the first time a colonial power had been decisively defeated by an Asian nationalist force. Over 10,000 French troops were captured, and the humiliating defeat shattered France's will to continue the war. The Geneva Conference, 1954, the division of Vietnam. Following the fall of Dien Bien Phu, world powers convened at the Geneva Conference to negotiate an end to the war. The conference, attended by France, the Viet Minh, the U.S., China, the Soviet Union, and other nations, led to a temporary agreement to de-escalate tensions in Vietnam. The key outcomes were: Vietnam was divided along the 17th parallel. The north would be controlled by Ho Chi Minh's communist government, while the south would remain under the rule of Emperor Bao Dai, later replaced by Ngo Dinh Diem. A national election was planned for 1956 to determine Vietnam's unified government. However, these elections were never held, as South Vietnam, backed by the U.S., feared a communist victory. France formally withdrew from Vietnam, ending its colonial rule in Indochina. The Geneva Accords failed to bring lasting peace. Instead, the division of Vietnam set the stage for the Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, with the United States taking over the role previously held by France in a new fight against communism, a war that never truly ended. The First Indochina War was more than just a struggle between the French and the Viet Minh. It was a turning point in global decolonization, Cold War politics, and the eventual involvement of the United States in Vietnam. While France's role in Vietnam ended in 1954, the division of the country and the unresolved ideological struggle made another war inevitable. Within a year, tensions escalated, leading to the beginning of the Vietnam War, which would prove even more devastating and far-reaching. Division of Vietnam. Following the Geneva Accords of 1954, Vietnam was temporarily divided along the 17th parallel, with North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh's communist government and South Vietnam under the rule of Emperor Bao Dai, a French-backed leader with little real power. The division was meant to be temporary, with nationwide elections scheduled for 1956 to determine Vietnam's unified government. However, these elections were never held, largely due to U.S. and South Vietnamese fears that Ho Chi Minh would win by a large margin. Instead, the United States increasingly backed South Vietnam as part of its broader Cold War strategy to contain communism. This led to the rise of Ngo Dinh Diem, a controversial and authoritarian leader who ruled South Vietnam with U.S. support. His rule was characterized by corruption, repression, religious discrimination, and political instability, ultimately leading to his downfall in 1963. Ngo Dinh Diem's rule, 1954 to 1963, a divisive leader. In 1954, Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunchly anti-communist Catholic, was appointed Prime Minister of South Vietnam. Diem, who had spent time in exile in the United States, was seen by Washington as the best candidate to lead South Vietnam against the Communist North. By 1955, he consolidated power, removed Emperor Bao Dai, and declared himself president of the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam. Diem's rule was deeply controversial due to several key factors: authoritarianism and political repression. Diem established a one-party rule, suppressing opposition groups, including Buddhists, neutralists, and communists, Viet Cong. He created the Personalist Labor Revolutionary Party, centered around his own ideology, and cracked down on dissent. Thousands of suspected communists and opponents were arrested, tortured, or executed under his Denounce Communists campaign. Corruption and nepotism. Diem's government was marked by rampant corruption, favoring his family and Catholic elite over the broader population. His brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, served as his chief advisor, and Ngu's wife, Madame Nhu, acted as the de facto First Lady, often making inflammatory statements. Another brother, Ngo Dinh Can, ruled central Vietnam with an iron grip, further alienating large sections of the population. Religious discrimination against Buddhists. Diem, a devout Catholic, favored fellow Catholics for government positions, military leadership, and land ownership, even though the majority of South Vietnam's population was Buddhist. Buddhists were often denied promotions in the military and civil service. Catholic churches received land grants and financial aid, while Buddhist temples faced restrictions. The situation escalated into the Buddhist crisis of 1963, which severely weakened Diem's rule. Land reform and repression. Policies that backfired. Diem attempted to implement land reform to redistribute land from wealthy landlords to peasants, but his policies were poorly executed and largely favored the landowning elite, rather than truly helping the rural poor. Many landlords were able to retain their land, while peasants were often forced into strategic hamlets, fortified villages meant to isolate them from Viet Cong influence. These hamlets displaced thousands of rural families, leading to resentment against the government. Meanwhile, Diem's security forces brutally suppressed opposition, leading to mass arrests, torture, and executions of suspected communists. Instead of stabilizing the country, these policies alienated rural populations and fueled support for the Viet Cong, the communist insurgents operating in the South. The Buddhist crisis, 1963, the breaking point. By 1963, Buddhist discontent with Diem's rule had reached a boiling point. The crisis was triggered on May 8, 1963, when South Vietnamese security forces opened fire on Buddhist protesters in Hue, killing 9 people. This incident sparked massive protests, leading to one of the most dramatic and globally significant moments of the Vietnam conflict. Buddhist monks staged demonstrations, hunger strikes, and sit-ins, demanding religious equality. On June 11, 1963, Thich Quang Duc, a Buddhist monk, set himself on fire in Saigon in a shocking act of protest. Photographs of his self-immolation became global symbols of resistance against Diem's government. Instead of de-escalating, Madame Nhu, Diem's sister-in-law, dismissed the protests, calling them a Buddhist barbecue, further enraging the public. The Buddhist crisis marked the beginning of Diem's downfall, as both the South Vietnamese military and the United States lost confidence in his leadership. Coup and assassination of Diem, November 1963. By late 1963, the situation in South Vietnam had deteriorated dramatically. The Viet Cong insurgency was growing, Diem's policies had alienated key sections of the population, and even his own military leadership had turned against him. The U.S., under President John F. Kennedy, initially supported Diem but began considering a change in leadership. On November 1, 1963, South Vietnamese military generals, led by General Duong Van Minh, launched a coup with covert support from the United States. Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu initially escaped capture and took refuge in a Catholic church in Saigon. However, they were discovered, arrested, and assassinated on November 2, 1963, while being transported in the back of an armored personnel carrier. Reports suggest that they were brutally executed. Diem's assassination plunged South Vietnam into political chaos, leading to a series of unstable governments and military coups. While the U.S. had hoped for a more stable leadership, the reality was far worse. South Vietnam became increasingly fragile and dependent on American military and financial support, paving the way for direct U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. A divided Vietnam and the road to war. The division of Vietnam in 1954 was meant to be temporary, but Ngo Dinh Diem's authoritarian rule, corruption, and religious discrimination deepened South Vietnam's instability. His assassination in 1963 did not bring stability. Instead, it fueled further chaos, strengthening the Viet Cong insurgency and drawing the United States deeper into the conflict. Within 2 years of Diem's fall, the situation in South Vietnam worsened significantly, leading to the Gulf of Tonkin Incident, 1964, and the full-scale U.S. military intervention in 1965. The division of Vietnam, which had begun as a political conflict, would soon escalate into one of the most devastating wars of the 20th century, the Vietnam War. By the late 1950s, South Vietnam faced a growing communist insurgency that would eventually evolve into the Viet Cong, VC, a formidable guerrilla force. Supported by North Vietnam, the Viet Cong aimed to undermine the South Vietnamese government and eventually reunify Vietnam under communist rule. The rise of the Viet Cong was driven by widespread discontent with the government of Ngo Dinh Diem, failed policies such as the Strategic Hamlet Program, and increasing external support from Hanoi and the Soviet bloc. Who were the Viet Cong? The Viet Cong, officially known as the National Liberation Front, NLF, was established in December 1960 as a political and military organization dedicated to overthrowing the U.S.-backed South Vietnamese government. The core members of the Viet Cong were Southern Communists, former Viet Minh fighters who had remained in the South after the First Indochina War. Many non-communist South Vietnamese who opposed Diem's rule also joined, believing the Viet Cong represented a more equitable alternative to Diem's corrupt regime. They received logistical, financial, and military aid from North Vietnam, which in turn was supported by China and the Soviet Union. Unlike a conventional army, the Viet Cong primarily relied on guerrilla warfare tactics, including hit-and-run attacks against South Vietnamese military outposts, sabotage operations targeting roads, bridges, and government infrastructure, political assassinations of South Vietnamese officials, landlords, and perceived collaborators. Propaganda campaigns aimed at gaining support from rural villagers. By the early 1960s, the Viet Cong had established a shadow government in many rural areas, effectively undermining South Vietnam's control outside of major cities. North Vietnam's support and the Ho Chi Minh Trail. North Vietnam played a crucial role in strengthening the Viet Cong by providing weapons and ammunition, including Soviet and Chinese-made rifles, mortars, and explosives. Training camps in North Vietnam, where Viet Cong fighters learned guerrilla tactics. Financial and logistical aid, allowing the Viet Cong to expand their operations. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex network of jungle paths and supply routes running through Laos and Cambodia, became the lifeline of the Viet Cong, enabling a steady flow of troops, supplies, and reinforcements from the north. Despite U.S. and South Vietnamese efforts to interdict the trail with bombing campaigns, it remained operational throughout the war, ensuring the Viet Cong remained well supplied. The Strategic Hamlet Program, a failed counterinsurgency effort. To counter the growing influence of the Viet Cong, Ngo Dinh Diem and his advisors, with American backing, launched the Strategic Hamlet Program in 1961. The program was intended to isolate rural villagers from Viet Cong influence by forcibly relocating entire communities into fortified villages, strategic hamlets, surrounded by barbed wire and defensive ditches, providing security forces to prevent Viet Cong infiltration, promoting anti-communist propaganda and loyalty to the South Vietnamese government. However, the program failed for several key reasons. Forced relocations. Many villagers were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands, creating widespread resentment against the government. Poor implementation. Hamlets were often underfunded and inadequately protected, making them easy targets for Viet Cong attacks. Corruption and mismanagement. Local officials frequently stole funds and supplies, leaving relocated villagers worse off than before. Viet Cong infiltration. Instead of keeping the communists out, the program allowed the Viet Cong to recruit angry, displaced peasants. Rather than weakening the Viet Cong, the Strategic Hamlet Program backfired, driving more rural South Vietnamese to support or join the Viet Cong. By 1963, the program had collapsed, marking a major failure of U.S.-backed counterinsurgency efforts. The escalation of Viet Cong attacks, 1961 to 1963. By 1962, the Viet Cong had expanded its operations across much of South Vietnam, launching increasingly bold attacks. January 2, 1963, Battle of AP Bac. The Viet Cong defeated a larger and better-equipped South Vietnamese Army, ARVN, force, showcasing their effectiveness in guerrilla warfare. This battle deeply shook U.S. confidence in the South Vietnamese military. Political assassinations. The Viet Cong regularly executed local officials, village chiefs, and suspected government informants, spreading fear in rural areas. Government presence in the countryside weakened, allowing the Viet Cong to establish liberated zones. Urban bombings and raids. The Viet Cong attacked military bases, government buildings, and even targets in Saigon, proving they could strike anywhere in South Vietnam. By the time of Ngo Dinh Diem's assassination in November 1963, the Viet Cong controlled large portions of the countryside, and the South Vietnamese government was increasingly unstable. The growing strength of the Viet Cong. Between 1960 and 1963, the Viet Cong transformed from a small insurgency into a major military and political force, threatening the very survival of South Vietnam. The failure of Diem's government to address political corruption and rural grievances fueled the Viet Cong's popularity. The Strategic Hamlet Program, intended to isolate the communists, alienated the rural population, increasing support for the insurgency. The Viet Cong's effective guerrilla warfare tactics and support from North Vietnam allowed them to expand their control over much of South Vietnam. By the end of 1963, with the South Vietnamese government weakened by internal chaos, the stage was set for the next phase of the conflict, an escalation of U.S. involvement, leading to the full-scale Vietnam War. This version provides a deeper dive into the origins of the Viet Cong, their tactics, and the failures of South Vietnam's counterinsurgency efforts, making the narrative more detailed and historically grounded. U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. The United States gradually escalated its involvement in Vietnam from a supporting role in the 1950s to direct military intervention by the mid-1960s. This period saw a transition from providing advisors and aid to full-scale war, culminating in a massive military presence that would define U.S. foreign policy for the next decade. 1. Early U.S. support, advisors and aid, 1955 to 1963. The Eisenhower administration, 1955 to 1961. After the Geneva Accords, 1954, temporarily divided Vietnam, the U.S. saw South Vietnam as a crucial bulwark against communism in Southeast Asia. Domino theory. The U.S. feared that if South Vietnam fell to communism, other nations in the region, such as Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand, would follow. The Military Assistance Advisory Group, MAAG, was established to train the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, and provide military aid. The U.S. helped Diem consolidate power, though his corruption and repression alienated much of the population. The Kennedy administration, 1961 to 1963. President John F. Kennedy significantly increased U.S. involvement, sending more military advisors, helicopters, and counterinsurgency experts. By 1963, the number of U.S. advisors had grown to 16,000, many of whom were directly involved in combat operations. The U.S. backed South Vietnam's efforts to suppress the Viet Cong, but Diem's failures, especially the Strategic Hamlet Program and Buddhist crisis, led to increasing instability. In November 1963, the CIA supported a coup that resulted in Diem's assassination, leaving South Vietnam politically fragmented. 2. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident and Escalation, 1964 to 1965. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, August 1964. In August 1964, the USS Maddox, a U.S. destroyer, was conducting electronic surveillance in the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam. Reports claim that North Vietnamese patrol boats attacked the Maddox. A second, disputed attack allegedly occurred 2 days later. While evidence later suggested the second attack may not have happened, the U.S. government used the incident as justification for military escalation. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, August 7, 1964. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting President Lyndon B. Johnson broad military powers to respond to North Vietnamese aggression without a formal declaration of war. This effectively gave Johnson a blank check to expand U.S. involvement, marking the beginning of full-scale American military intervention. 3. Operation Rolling Thunder, 1965 to 1968, the aerial assault on North Vietnam. Objectives of Operation Rolling Thunder: destroy North Vietnam's war infrastructure, military bases, supply depots, roads, and bridges. Cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail, preventing supplies from reaching the Viet Cong in the south. Break North Vietnam's will to fight and pressure them into negotiations. The bombing campaign. Launched in March 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder was the most sustained bombing campaign in U.S. history at the time. U.S. aircraft, including B-52 bombers, fighter jets, and napalm strikes, targeted strategic locations in North Vietnam. However, North Vietnam's resilience, anti-aircraft defenses, and Soviet and Chinese aid helped them withstand the bombing. Over 900 U.S. aircraft were lost, and the campaign ultimately failed to force North Vietnam to surrender. Impact and consequences. The bombing campaign caused immense destruction but failed to achieve its objectives. Civilian casualties soared, leading to increased anti-American sentiment in both Vietnam and globally. Instead of weakening the enemy, the bombing hardened North Vietnamese resolve and increased support for the war effort. 4. Deployment of ground troops and escalation of combat, 1965 to 1968. The first U.S. combat troops, March 1965. In March 1965, President Johnson ordered the first U.S. ground combat troops into Vietnam. The 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade landed at Da Nang, marking the official start of American ground war operations. Massive troop buildup, 1965 to 1968. Johnson dramatically escalated U.S. troop numbers. 1965, 184,000 troops. 1966, 385,000 troops. 1967, 485,000 troops. 1968, over 540,000 U.S. troops were stationed in Vietnam. The goal was to conduct large-scale search and destroy missions to weaken the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army, NVA. The challenges of guerrilla warfare. Unlike conventional battles, U.S. forces faced an elusive enemy well adapted to jungle terrain. The Viet Cong utilized booby traps, tunnels, and ambushes to counter U.S. firepower. Hit-and-run attacks rather than direct engagement, blending in with civilian populations, making it difficult to distinguish friend from foe. Search and destroy missions. U.S. forces launched aggressive operations to find and eliminate Viet Cong strongholds. These missions often resulted in high U.S. casualties due to guerrilla tactics. Destruction of villages led to more civilian deaths and resentment from the local population. The U.S. is trapped in a stalemate. By 1968, despite deploying over 500,000 troops and launching massive bombing campaigns, the U.S. had failed to defeat the Viet Cong or North Vietnam. The Viet Cong remained strong, with continued Ho Chi Minh Trail reinforcements. U.S. casualties mounted, with thousands of American soldiers killed each year. The war became increasingly unpopular at home, with growing anti-war protests in the U.S. The next phase of the war would see the Tet Offensive, 1968, a major turning point that shattered U.S. confidence in victory and led to a shift in public opinion against the war. This expanded version provides a more detailed and engaging look at U.S. involvement, breaking down the key events, strategies, and challenges the U.S. faced. Major battles and campaigns of the Vietnam War. As the U.S. deepened its involvement in Vietnam, large-scale battles and operations defined the conflict. The war's unique nature, characterized by guerrilla warfare, dense jungle terrain, and relentless North Vietnamese resilience, challenged U.S. military strategies. These major engagements showcased both American firepower and North Vietnamese tenacity, often leading to high casualties with little long-term strategic gain. 1. The Battle of Ia Drang, November 14 to 18, 1965, the first major clash. Context and importance. The Battle of Ia Drang was the first major direct confrontation between the U.S. Army and the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN. It took place in the central highlands of South Vietnam, near the Ia Drang Valley, a region of dense jungle and mountainous terrain. This battle was a test of U.S. air mobility doctrine, as American troops relied heavily on helicopters for transport and support. It also set the stage for future battles, demonstrating the ferocity of North Vietnamese forces and their ability to engage U.S. troops in direct combat. The battle. On November 14, 1965, the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, under Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore, was airlifted into LZ X-ray, deep in PAVN-controlled territory. Surprise attack. Shortly after landing, U.S. troops were ambushed by a numerically superior PAVN force. Close-quarters combat erupted, with American troops holding their ground against repeated assaults. Air power saves the day. Heavy U.S. artillery, helicopter gunships, and airstrikes inflicted devastating losses on the North Vietnamese, allowing U.S. forces to hold out. On November 17th, a second engagement at LZ Albany saw another surprise ambush, leading to severe American casualties. Outcome and significance. Casualties, U.S., 305 killed, 524 wounded. PAVN, estimated 1,000 to 1,500 killed. Tactical victory for the U.S., strategic victory for North Vietnam. The U.S. forces secured the battlefield, but the PAVN proved their ability to engage U.S. forces directly and sustain heavy casualties. The battle shaped U.S. strategy, reinforcing the importance of air mobility but also highlighting the challenges of jungle warfare. 2. Operation Cedar Falls, January 8 to 26, 1967. The largest search and destroy mission. Objective and strategy. Operation Cedar Falls was a massive search and destroy operation aimed at eliminating the Viet Cong stronghold in the Iron Triangle, a key area 30 miles north of Saigon. The region was heavily fortified with tunnels, bunkers, and booby traps, making it a crucial Viet Cong base for attacks on South Vietnamese and U.S. forces. The operation involved 16,000 U.S. troops and 14,000 South Vietnamese soldiers, making it one of the largest operations of the war. The battle. U.S. forces used B-52 bombers, artillery, and mechanized infantry to weaken enemy positions. Tunnel warfare. The Viet Cong had an extensive network of underground tunnels, some up to 200 miles long, allowing them to evade American attacks. Forcible evacuations. Over 6,000 Vietnamese civilians were forcibly relocated, and entire villages were destroyed to prevent Viet Cong return. Outcome and consequences. Casualties: 72 killed, 337 wounded. Viet Cong: over 750 killed, hundreds captured. Temporary victory. The U.S. disrupted Viet Cong activity, but the Viet Cong quickly reoccupied the area after U.S. forces withdrew. Long-term failure. The mass displacement of civilians fueled resentment against the U.S. and South Vietnamese government, ultimately strengthening Viet Cong recruitment. 3. The Battle of Dak Tu, November 3 to 22, 1967. Brutal mountain warfare. Background. Dak Tu, a remote outpost in the Central Highlands, became a battleground for intense jungle and hilltop fighting. The North Vietnamese sought to weaken U.S. forces and draw them into prolonged engagements in treacherous terrain. The battle saw elite U.S. airborne troops from the 173rd Airborne Brigade engage in some of the fiercest fighting of the war. The battle. Hill 875. One of the deadliest engagements, as U.S. forces assaulted heavily fortified North Vietnamese positions on a strategic hill. Brutal conditions. U.S. troops faced booby traps, ambushes, and intense artillery fire. The rugged terrain hampered reinforcements and medical evacuations. After days of vicious combat, the U.S. finally took Hill 875, but at a terrible cost. Outcome and consequences. Casualties: U.S. 376 killed, 1,441 wounded. PAVN. Estimated 600 plus killed. Symbolic victory. The U.S. held the battlefield, but the high casualties shook morale and questioned the war's effectiveness. 4. The Battle of Khe Sanh, January 21 to July 9, 1968. A siege like Dien Bien Phu. Background. The U.S. Marine Corps base at Khe Sanh, near the Laotian border, became a symbol of U.S. resolve in early 1968. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, launched a 77-day siege, reminiscent of the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, 1954. The battle. Massive artillery barrages. The NVA relentlessly shelled the base, cutting off supplies and pinning down the Marines. U.S. air superiority. Operation Niagara. The U.S. launched 100,000 tons of bombs to break the siege. Helicopter resupply missions kept the Marines from collapsing. After months of brutal combat, the siege was lifted as U.S. forces launched a counteroffensive. Outcome and significance. Casualties: 703 killed, 2,500 wounded. NVA. Estimated 10,000 plus killed. Victory, but at a cost. The U.S. secured Khe Sanh, but shortly after, abandoned the base, raising questions about the necessity of holding it in the first place. Diversion for Tet Offensive. Some historians believe the siege was a distraction for the Tet Offensive, which began shortly after. Conclusion. Heavy battles, uncertain gains. Between 1965 and 1968, the U.S. fought some of the most intense battles of the war, showcasing American firepower and tactical superiority. However, these battles failed to break North Vietnamese resolve. The Viet Cong and NVA absorbed losses and adapted their strategies. U.S. forces suffered high casualties, leading to growing discontent among troops and the American public. The Tet Offensive, 1968, would soon shock the U.S. and shift public opinion against the war. Tet Offensive. The turning point of the Vietnam War. The Tet Offensive of 1968 marked a pivotal moment in the Vietnam War. While the U.S. had superior firepower and had claimed military progress, this massive, coordinated attack by the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and Viet Cong, VC, shattered the illusion of impending victory. Though the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces ultimately repelled the offensive, the battle had devastating consequences for American public opinion and the political landscape back home. 1. The Tet Offensive, January 30 to March 28, 1968. A coordinated shockwave. Background and planning. The Tet Offensive was a carefully planned, countrywide assault launched by the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and the Viet Cong, VC. It coincided with Tet, The Vietnamese Lunar New Year, a time traditionally associated with truce and celebration. The NVA and VC aim to overwhelm U.S. and South Vietnamese forces with simultaneous attacks, trigger a general uprising among South Vietnamese civilians, break U.S. morale, and force a withdrawal. Over 80,000 communist troops attacked more than 100 towns, cities, and military bases across South Vietnam. The attacks begin a nationwide assault. In the early hours of January 30th, 1968, the offensive began with a wave of surprise attacks. Among the key targets, Saigon, the capital, Viet Cong commandos stormed the U.S. Embassy, engaging in a 6-hour gunfight before being neutralized. Hue, the imperial city. The communists seized control, turning it into one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Da Nang, Nha Trang, and major provincial capitals each faced heavy fighting and sabotage. The unexpected scale and intensity of the offensive shocked U.S. commanders and the public. 2. The Battle of Hue, January 31st to February 25, 1968. Urban warfare in the ancient capital. Communist takeover. Hue, a city of 140,000 people, was of immense cultural and strategic importance. On January 31st, 10,000 NVA and Viet Cong troops infiltrated the city and swiftly captured key locations. Government buildings, the Imperial Palace, and the main bridges fell under communist control. Brutal house-to-house combat. U.S. Marines and Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, forces launched a counteroffensive but faced stiff resistance. The communists had heavily fortified the city, using tunnels, barricades, and sniper nests. U.S. forces had to fight block by block, house by house, suffering heavy casualties, massacres, and destruction. As the U.S. and ARVN retook Hue, they discovered mass graves, evidence of brutal executions carried out by the communists. Over 3,000 civilians were massacred for being suspected of ties to the South Vietnamese government. By the end of the 26-day battle, the city was devastated, with half of its structures reduced to rubble. Casualties. U.S. 216 killed, 1,600 wounded. ARVN 384 killed. NVA/VC 5,000 plus killed. Civilians 5,800 killed/missing. 3. Media coverage. The war comes home. The role of journalism. The Tet Offensive was the most widely covered event of the war. Unlike previous conflicts, journalists had unrestricted access to battle zones, capturing graphic footage of the war's brutality. The attack on the U.S. Embassy in Saigon was broadcast live, shattering the U.S. government's claims that the war was under control. Walter Cronkite and the turning of public opinion. CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite, one of America's most trusted journalists, visited Vietnam during Tet. After witnessing the devastation, he concluded, "We are mired in stalemate." President Lyndon B. Johnson reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Impact on American morale. The images of dead U.S. soldiers, destroyed cities, and desperate Vietnamese civilians fueled anti-war sentiment. The perception that the U.S. was losing the war intensified protests at home. Confidence in the government's leadership crumbled, as officials had previously claimed victory was near. 4. Political fallout. A war unwinnable? The Johnson administration in crisis. Before Tet, U.S. leaders had been optimistic, believing the war was nearing its end. The offensive proved otherwise and shattered public trust in President Lyndon B. Johnson. As protests mounted, Johnson faced a political disaster. Lyndon B. Johnson's bombshell announcement. On March 31, 1968, Johnson shocked the nation by announcing he would not seek re-election. He also scaled back bombing campaigns and opened peace talks with North Vietnam and Paris. Impact on the U.S. strategy. The Tet Offensive marked a turning point. Before Tet, U.S. policy focused on military victory. After Tet, it shifted towards seeking a way out. The U.S. realized that no amount of firepower could break the North Vietnamese resolve. 5. The aftermath, a tactical loss, a strategic victory for North Vietnam. Who really won? Military outcome. The U.S. and ARVN ultimately repelled the Tet Offensive, inflicting heavy casualties on communist forces. The Viet Cong, in particular, was devastated. It would never fully recover as an effective fighting force. Strategic and psychological victory for North Vietnam. The sheer scale of the offensive stunned the U.S. public. The myth of U.S. progress in Vietnam was shattered. The American public increasingly saw the war as unwinnable. Tet's role in ending the war. The offensive accelerated U.S. withdrawal, leading to a shift in U.S. policy toward Vietnamization, transferring combat responsibility to the South Vietnamese. A rise in anti-war protests, demanding an end to U.S. involvement. The 1973 U.S. withdrawal and, ultimately, the fall of Saigon in 1975. Tet Offensive, the war's defining moment. The Tet Offensive was a defining moment in the Vietnam War. While the U.S. won on the battlefield, the psychological and political damage it inflicted reshaped the course of the war. The Battle of Hue showcased the brutality of urban warfare. The media exposed the true horrors of Vietnam, swaying public opinion. The Johnson administration collapsed under pressure, leading to a shift in U.S. strategy. Though the Tet Offensive cost the Communists dearly, it ultimately pushed the U.S. toward disengagement, a long-term victory for North Vietnam. To make sure you didn't miss anything, in more detail about the war's most controversial moments. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Vietnam War had become a deeply polarizing issue in the United States. What had started as a mission to stop the spread of communism had evolved into a brutal, morally complex conflict that seemed unwinnable. Key events such as the My Lai massacre, the rise of the anti-war movement, and the Cambodian campaign intensified public opposition and further eroded confidence in the U.S. government's handling of the war. 1. My Lai massacre, March 16, 1968. The war's darkest hour. The massacre unfolds. In the village of My Lai, located in South Vietnam's Quang Ngai province, U.S. soldiers from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, were sent on a search and destroy mission. Intelligence suggested that My Lai was a Viet Cong stronghold, but when soldiers arrived, they encountered only unarmed civilians, men, women, children, and the elderly. Instead of finding enemy combatants, U.S. troops, led by Lieutenant William Calley, opened fire, killing between 347 and 504 civilians. Women were raped, children were shot, and entire families were executed. The massacre lasted for several hours. A helicopter pilot, Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson Jr., and his crew intervened, landing between U.S. troops and fleeing villagers. They threatened to fire on American soldiers if they didn't stop the killing and managed to rescue a handful of survivors. Cover-up and exposure. The U.S. Army initially tried to cover up the massacre, reporting it as a successful operation with 128 Viet Cong fighters killed. However, whistleblower Ron Ridenour, a former soldier, learned the truth and sent letters to government officials and journalists, demanding an investigation. In November 1969, journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story, causing global outrage. Photographs taken by Army photographer Ronald Heberl were published, showing piles of dead bodies, fueling worldwide condemnation. Aftermath and trial of Lieutenant William Calley. Lieutenant Calley was the only soldier convicted, sentenced to life in prison for ordering the massacre. However, under public pressure, President Richard Nixon reduced his sentence, and Calley served only 3.5 years under house arrest. The My Lai massacre shattered America's moral justification for the war, leading to widespread disillusionment and fueling the anti-war movement. 2. The anti-war movement, America's growing opposition, 1968 to 1973. As the war dragged on, public opposition intensified. A broad coalition of students, veterans, civil rights activists, and even politicians began demanding an end to U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Protests on college campuses. Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, became a leading voice, organizing massive protests and sit-ins at universities. 1968 Democratic National Convention, Chicago. Tens of thousands of anti-war protesters gathered in Chicago, where police brutally attacked them on live television. The chaotic images reinforced the perception that the government was losing control. Veterans against the war. Many soldiers who had served in Vietnam returned home disillusioned and joined the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, VVAW. They testified before Congress, exposing war crimes, atrocities, and the psychological toll of combat. Some veterans threw away their medals in protest, symbolizing their betrayal by the U.S. government. The role of civil rights leaders. Martin Luther King Jr. publicly condemned the war in his 1967 speech, Beyond Vietnam, calling it a distraction from domestic racial justice issues. His opposition further connected the civil rights and anti-war movements, strengthening resistance to the conflict. Kent State shootings, May 4, 1970, when protests turned deadly. After the U.S. invaded Cambodia in 1970, protests erupted nationwide. At Kent State University in Ohio, the National Guard opened fire on unarmed student protesters, killing 4 and wounding 9. A photo of a grieving young woman kneeling over a dead student became one of the most iconic images of the era. Public outrage skyrocketed, and protests spread to hundreds of campuses. Impact on U.S. policy. The growing public discontent put enormous pressure on the Nixon administration. Congress began restricting funding for the war, pushing for de-escalation. The anti-war movement played a crucial role in forcing Nixon to gradually withdraw troops. 3. Cambodian Campaign, April-June 1970. Expanding the war. Why Cambodia? North Vietnamese troops had long used Cambodia as a safe haven, moving supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. President Richard Nixon, seeking to cut off enemy supply lines, expanded the war into Cambodia. This included secret bombing campaigns, under Operation Menu, and a ground invasion by U.S. and South Vietnamese troops. The ground invasion. On April 30, 1970, Nixon announced a joint U.S.-South Vietnamese incursion into Cambodia to destroy North Vietnamese bases. The operation involved over 30,000 U.S. and 50,000 South Vietnamese troops. While the invasion temporarily disrupted Viet Cong supply routes, the North Vietnamese quickly regrouped. Consequences of the Cambodian campaign. The war had officially expanded into a neutral country, sparking international condemnation. The incursion destabilized Cambodia, leading to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, a brutal communist regime responsible for the Cambodian genocide, 1975 to 1979. At home, the American public reacted with fury, triggering some of the largest anti-war protests in U.S. history. Nixon's response. The silent majority. Despite protests, Nixon doubled down on his war policy, arguing that a silent majority of Americans supported him. However, public trust in the government continued to erode, setting the stage for further U.S. withdrawals. 4. The war's unraveling, the path to withdrawal. By 1971 to 1973, the combined impact of My Lai, anti-war protests, and the failed Cambodian campaign had deeply weakened U.S. resolve. The Pentagon Papers, leaked in 1971, revealed that the U.S. government had misled the public about the war, further eroding trust. By 1973, Nixon had ended the draft and signed the Paris Peace Accords, signaling the official withdrawal of U.S. troops. However, the damage had been done. The Vietnam War had divided the nation, leaving a lasting impact on American politics and culture. A nation in turmoil. The period from 1968 to 1970 marked the most critical turning points of the Vietnam War. The My Lai massacre exposed the horrors of the war, fueling outrage and moral reckoning. The anti-war movement reached unprecedented levels, forcing the government to reconsider its policies. The Cambodian campaign expanded the war but only worsened public opposition and global condemnation. Events like the Kent State shootings deepened domestic divisions, increasing pressure on Nixon to withdraw U.S. troops. By 1973, the United States had begun its final retreat from Vietnam. However, the scars of these turning points would linger for decades, shaping U.S. military policy and public skepticism toward future wars. We recognize that the volume of information can be overwhelming, and we hope that this deeper exploration of the turning points, their consequences, and their significance in shaping the outcome of the war will provide clarity and understanding. Your grasp of these key elements is crucial, and we trust that this insight will be beneficial. De-escalation and withdrawal. The end of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. By the early 1970s, the Vietnam War had become increasingly unpopular in the United States. Mounting casualties, rising protests, and political scandals placed immense pressure on the U.S. government to find a way out of the conflict. President Richard Nixon's strategy focused on Vietnamization, an effort to shift the burden of the war onto South Vietnam's military while gradually withdrawing American troops. However, as the U.S. presence dwindled, the South Vietnamese government struggled to hold its ground against the North. Despite a temporary ceasefire agreement in 1973, fighting between North and South Vietnam continued, and within 2 years, Saigon fell, marking the official end of the war. 1. Vietnamization, 1969 to 1973. Nixon's exit strategy. Origins of the policy. By 1969, the U.S. had been engaged in Vietnam for nearly a decade, and public opposition was at an all-time high. Richard Nixon, who took office in January 1969, sought a way to withdraw U.S. forces without appearing to lose the war. His administration introduced Vietnamization, a policy that aimed to strengthen the South Vietnamese military so it could take over combat operations while U.S. troops gradually withdrew. Key elements of Vietnamization: military training and modernization. The U.S. provided billions in military aid to train and equip the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. New weapons, aircraft, and armored vehicles were supplied to South Vietnamese forces. Air support and advisors remained in place, but direct combat involvement by U.S. troops was reduced. Pacification efforts. The program also aimed to win the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese population by improving governance, economic conditions, and security. The Phoenix program was used to identify and eliminate Viet Cong sympathizers, but it was controversial due to alleged human rights abuses. Gradual U.S. troop withdrawals. In June 1969, Nixon announced the first withdrawal of 25,000 U.S. troops. By 1972, U.S. troop levels had dropped from over 500,000 in 1968 to less than 30,000. However, air support and bombing campaigns intensified to compensate for the reduced ground presence. Challenges and failures of Vietnamization. The ARVN remained heavily dependent on U.S. air power and logistics. South Vietnamese troops often lacked the morale and leadership to sustain prolonged combat. In 1972, the North launched the Easter Offensive, a massive invasion of South Vietnam. ARVN forces struggled to contain the assault without direct U.S. ground support. Operation Linebacker, an intense U.S. bombing campaign, helped push back the offensive. This proved that South Vietnam was still not fully capable of defending itself. 2. The Paris Peace Accords, 1973, a fragile ceasefire. Background and negotiations. By 1972, Nixon was eager to end direct U.S. involvement in the war, especially with re-election approaching. Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor, led secret negotiations with North Vietnam's Le Duc Tho. The talks were contentious, as North Vietnam demanded U.S. withdrawal, while the U.S. insisted on preserving South Vietnam's independence. The agreement key terms of the Paris Peace Accords. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed by the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong. The agreement included a ceasefire across Vietnam, withdrawal of all remaining U.S. troops within 60 days, exchange of prisoners of war, POWs, including the return of American POWs like John McCain, recognition of the territorial boundaries of South Vietnam, though North Vietnamese troops were allowed to remain in the South. Formation of a National Council of Reconciliation and Concord, aimed at facilitating future elections and political unity. The reality: did the accords work? The ceasefire collapsed almost immediately. North Vietnam continued its military operations, using the time to resupply and regroup. The U.S. had withdrawn its combat forces, but continued sending aid and air support to South Vietnam. By 1975, North Vietnam launched a full-scale invasion, leading to the fall of Saigon. 3. Watergate Scandal, 1972 to 1974. Nixon's downfall and the end of U.S. support. The Watergate break-in. On June 17, 1972, 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee, DNC, headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. They were attempting to wiretap phones and steal documents. Investigations revealed they were linked to Nixon's re-election campaign, Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP. Cover-up and exposure. Nixon and his aides attempted a cover-up, using hush money, destroying evidence, and ordering the CIA to block investigations. Journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein from the Washington Post uncovered the scandal. Secret White House tapes, recorded by Nixon, provided undeniable evidence of his involvement. Facing impeachment, Nixon resigned on August 8, 1974, becoming the first U.S. president to do so. Vice President Gerald Ford took over and later pardoned Nixon, sparking public outrage. Impact on the Vietnam War. Watergate further eroded trust in the U.S. government, reinforcing the public's skepticism about the war. Congress cut military aid to South Vietnam, leaving it even weaker against the advancing North. The U.S. was now politically incapable of intervening further. 4. The final withdrawal and the fall of Saigon, 1975. North Vietnam's final offensive. In March 1975, the North launched a full-scale invasion of South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese army, without U.S. support, collapsed rapidly. Cities fell one by one, and by April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. The dramatic U.S. evacuation. As the North advanced, thousands of South Vietnamese civilians and U.S. personnel scrambled to escape. Operation Frequent Wind, the largest helicopter evacuation in history, took place on April 29 to 30, 1975. Desperate South Vietnamese citizens clung to helicopters and tried to flee by boat. Images of helicopters evacuating people from the U.S. Embassy rooftop became a symbol of America's humiliating exit. The war's legacy. The period of de-escalation, 1969 to 1975, marked the final chapter of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Vietnamization failed to create a self-sufficient South Vietnam. The Paris Peace Accords provided only a temporary reprieve before South Vietnam's collapse. The Watergate scandal crippled Nixon, leading to reduced U.S. support for South Vietnam. The fall of Saigon in 1975 marked the official end of the war, with Vietnam reunified under communist rule. Despite ending U.S. involvement, the war left deep scars on America's political, social, and military policies for decades. This expanded version dives deeper into the key events, their consequences, and their impact on U.S. policy. The fall of Saigon, the end of the Vietnam War. By early 1975, South Vietnam was in a dire state. After the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, U.S. forces had withdrawn, leaving the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, to defend itself. However, without continued U.S. military and financial support, South Vietnam was unable to withstand the final assault by North Vietnamese forces. In March 1975, the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, launched a massive final offensive, overwhelming ARVN forces with lightning-fast advances. Within weeks, major cities fell, and by April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon, marking the official end of the Vietnam War and the beginning of a reunified communist Vietnam. The fall of Saigon was a chaotic and dramatic event, with thousands of U.S. personnel, South Vietnamese officials, and civilians desperately trying to flee. The largest helicopter evacuation in history, known as Operation Frequent Wind, unfolded as North Vietnamese forces entered the city. 1. The final offensive, March, April 1975. The collapse of South Vietnam. North Vietnam's military strategy. The Paris Peace Accords, 1973, had established a ceasefire, but North Vietnam never intended to abide by it. Using the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the PAVN rebuilt, rearmed, and planned a final assault on South Vietnam. Soviet and Chinese support provided advanced tanks, artillery, and anti-aircraft weapons. The rapid fall of South Vietnam. On March 10, 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched their final offensive by attacking Ban My Thuot in the Central Highlands. The ARVN, already demoralized and outnumbered, struggled to hold its positions. President Nguyen Van Thieu ordered a hasty retreat from the Central Highlands, hoping to consolidate forces further south. However, the withdrawal turned into chaos, with entire ARVN divisions collapsing or surrendering. Key battles leading to Saigon's fall. Fall of Da Nang, March 29, 1975. The second-largest city in South Vietnam was quickly surrounded. ARVN soldiers and civilians rushed to the beaches in an attempt to flee by boat. Da Nang fell with little resistance, showing how weak the South's defenses had become. Fall of Nha Trang, Canaan, and Hue, early April 1975. Cities fell one after another, with minimal ARVN resistance. Refugees flooded into Saigon, causing widespread panic and chaos. The final push, North Vietnamese advance on Saigon, late April 1975. By April 20, 1975, North Vietnamese forces had encircled Saigon. President Thieu resigned on April 21, blaming the U.S. for abandoning South Vietnam. His successor, Nguyen Van Minh, attempted to negotiate a peaceful surrender, but North Vietnam refused. 2. The fall of Saigon, April 30, 1975, the end of the war. The last days of Saigon. As North Vietnamese forces closed in, Saigon descended into panic. Tens of thousands of South Vietnamese officials, soldiers, and civilians feared reprisals from the communist forces. The U.S. Embassy became a focal point, with desperate people trying to secure a way out. Looting, chaos, and violence erupted across the city. Operation Frequent Wind, the desperate evacuation. April 29 to 30, 1975. The U.S. carried out Operation Frequent Wind, the largest helicopter evacuation in history. Over 7,000 people, including American diplomats, military personnel, and South Vietnamese allies, were airlifted to waiting U.S. Navy ships off the coast. Helicopters took off from the U.S. Embassy and other locations as thousands of people desperately tried to climb over the embassy walls. Some South Vietnamese pilots flew their own helicopters out to sea, ditching them in the water after dropping off passengers. The moment Saigon fell. At dawn on April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks smashed through the gates of the presidential palace. President Nguyen Van Minh surrendered unconditionally. Communist flags were raised over the palace, officially marking the end of South Vietnam and the war itself. 3. Aftermath and consequences. Reunification of Vietnam. On July 2, 1976, Vietnam was officially reunified under communist rule as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City in honor of the North's revolutionary leader. A period of political repression and economic hardship followed, as former South Vietnamese officials and military officers were sent to re-education camps. The refugee crisis. Hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese fled the country, fearing persecution. Many became boat people, escaping by dangerous sea routes to neighboring countries. The U.S. and other Western nations accepted thousands of Vietnamese refugees, leading to the establishment of large Vietnamese communities in the U.S., Canada, and Australia. The end of U.S. involvement. The fall of Saigon marked a humiliating defeat for the United States. The war cost over 58,000 American lives, with millions of Vietnamese casualties. The failure of the U.S. to prevent South Vietnam's collapse led to deep skepticism about future military interventions, influencing American foreign policy for decades. The lasting impact of the fall of Saigon. The fall of Saigon was one of the most dramatic and symbolic events of the 20th century, representing the failure of U.S. intervention in Vietnam, the resilience of North Vietnam and its ability to wage long-term war, the suffering of South Vietnamese people, many of whom faced imprisonment or exile, a shift in American foreign policy, making future wars, such as those in the Middle East, more controversial and carefully considered. The chaotic evacuation, the desperate images of helicopters leaving the U.S. Embassy, and the North Vietnamese tanks rolling into the city remain powerful symbols of the war's end, and a reminder of the costs of interventionist conflicts. The lasting legacy of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was one of the most complex, divisive, and consequential conflicts of the 20th century. It was not just a war between North and South Vietnam, but a battleground for global Cold War rivalries, involving the United States, the Soviet Union, China, and other nations. The war's legacy transcended the battlefield, leaving lasting impacts on geopolitics, military strategy, public trust in government, and cultural consciousness worldwide. A war of many dimensions. From its origins in Vietnam's struggle for independence from French colonial rule to its transformation into a brutal proxy war between communist and anti-communist forces, the conflict was shaped by ideology, nationalism, and foreign intervention. The war evolved into a prolonged and bloody struggle that spanned decades, reshaping the political and social landscapes of multiple nations. The costs of war. Human toll. The war resulted in millions of deaths, including Vietnamese civilians and soldiers, American troops, and other combatants. The scars of war remained for decades in the form of physical destruction, economic hardship, and psychological trauma. Environmental devastation. The widespread use of chemical defoliants like Agent Orange left long-term consequences, causing severe health issues, birth defects, and ecological damage. Political consequences. The war significantly altered American foreign policy, leading to a more cautious approach to military interventions, a mindset often referred to as Vietnam Syndrome. Social and cultural impact. The Vietnam War shaped anti-war movements, civil rights activism, and public distrust in government, influencing future conflicts and protest movements worldwide. An enduring legacy. Even decades after the war ended, its effects continue to shape global politics and society. The war influenced U.S. military strategy in later conflicts, including Iraq and Afghanistan, with lessons learned about asymmetrical warfare, counterinsurgency, and the limits of military intervention. In Vietnam, the war left deep scars, but economic reforms and modernization efforts have gradually transformed the nation into an emerging global player. Final reflections. The Vietnam War was more than just a military conflict. It was a turning point in history, with consequences that reverberate across generations. It forced nations and individuals alike to grapple with difficult moral, political, and social questions about the nature of war, intervention, and human resilience. This detailed examination of the Vietnam War has provided a comprehensive narrative of its key events, major battles, political shifts, and long-term impact. While the war may have ended in April 1975, its legacy remains deeply embedded in the history of Vietnam, the United States, and the world.